BBC News at 3 minutes past 10. Our next is at 11.
BBC Radio 2 FM.
Away with dull care, the day is set fair, a wireless set near to bring us good cheer. In winter time or summertime, or leisure time and pleasure time, the daily times at Big Ben chimes are radio times.
Hello, I'm Barry Took. Although the BBC is 75 this year, Radio Times is only 74. Mind you, there are those who think that it's always been 74. Staid, stolid and utterly reliable. In its remarkable lifetime, it has listed on its programme pages saints and sinners, frauds and fools, statesmen, sportsmen, knockabout comics, and some of the world's greatest actors. But fascinating as a trawl through the programme pages might be, I shall be looking at the correspondence columns, which have been a feature of Radio Times since it was first published in October 1923, before most of us were born. The BBC was the British Broadcasting Company then. The corporation only arrived in 1928, but Radio Times is what the journal of the BBC's activities was called in the beginning and remains so today. Let's take a look back at the early days and what listeners were saying about the infant wireless.
23rd of September, 1923. Radio Times, Volume 1, Number 1. Price, twopence.
Sirs, I hear you are publishing a new weekly, and that it is not your intention to entertain us with descriptions of wireless sets manufactured out of nutshells and so on. Congratulations.
This first correspondent, quoted only as PJ of Birmingham, goes on at some length and asks questions about the BBC's broadcasting policy.
Do they think the majority of their listeners?
And listeners, by the way, is in quotes, because at that time there was quite a discussion about what those who tuned in to 2LO and the rest should be called back in 1923. Listeners? Listeners in. There was even one suggestion that they should be called radiords. Anyway, here's PJ.
Are listeners really interested in such lectures as the decrease of malaria in Great Britain, how to become a veterinary surgeon, the new Rent Act, how to become a solicitor?
Well, I suppose if you wanted to become a vet or a solicitor, you would be interested. PJ goes on.
Also, why cannot the announcers exercise a little humour? No one particularly likes a mechanical announcement.
The editor answers. Announcers have a difficult task in balancing their remarks to meet all tastes. Even the greeting, hello everybody, is considered undue familiarity among some listeners. There were to be lots more in the vexed subject of announcers in the years to come. But let's move to a different, equally perennial topic, the weather. Here in 1923 is the view from Professor A.M. Lowe.
Centuries after the present generation has passed away, people will look back upon the infancy of radio as we view the period prior to utilising the power of steam.
Well, there's a first. Steam and radio in one sentence. The professor continues,
I say that radio waves will have become almost vital, as there is no limit to the uses in which they will be put.
And here you can feel his eyeballs starting to revolve.
Summertime, with its heat waves and unreliable weather conditions, will be more or less under the control of human beings.
Tell that to Michael Fish.
And there is no reason why heat should not be reduced by wireless as well as created by it.
I don't think Professor Lowe had quite grasped what the wireless was, but it was new and was being evolved week by week, spurred on, it must be said, by the listeners. By 1928, radio was pretty well established, and the Radio Times could put its tongue firmly in its cheek and devote a page to...
Opinions expressed at the recent violent debate on what's wrong with broadcasting held by...
Wait for it.
The Birtle Amateur Dramatic and Debating Society in the Village Institute of Birtle in the Briar.
That broadcasting isn't what it was.
That broadcasting is responsible for the bad weather.
That the BBC always chooses its best programmes when I have to go out to dinner.
That you don't need to have a licence if your aerial doesn't show.
That anybody could think of better programmes standing on their head.
That practically everything broadcast is an insult to my intelligence.
That according to my kitchen clock, the Greenwich time signal was late last night.
That no one likes the modern music that the BBC broadcasts.
But what was this modern music that the BBC broadcast? Well, listen.
I'm
I'm happy, so happy, walking on air, the why and the wherefore. It's someone I care for. I'm yelling, I'm telling folks everywhere, I know that she loves me, so what do I care? There's a rainbow around my shoulder and a sky of blue above. Oh, the sun shines bright, the world's all right, 'cause I'm in love. There's a rainbow around my shoulder and it fits me like a glove. Let it blow and storm, I'll be warm, 'cause I'm in love. Hallelujah, how the folks will stare when they see that great big solitaire. That my little sugar baby is going away. There's a rainbow around my shoulder and a sky of blue above. And I'm shouting so the world will know that I'm in love.
Al Jolson there with There's a Rainbow Round My Shoulder. More music in a moment. But now, this from HHA of London.
I think it would become a very popular feature if lessons in the Morse code were given once or twice a week.
But hark, transmission from l'École Supérieure des Postes et Télégraphes from Paris included.
Tuesday, 8:15 p.m, course of talks on the Morse code.
While wireless transmissions from the Eiffel Tower included
11 to 11:15, talk on fish from the Central Hall, Paris. Every day except Monday.
Yes, fish. If it's Tuesday, it must be halibut. But apart from Morse code and fish, what other benefits did this new medium bestow? This letter, headed, Does Listening Promote Health?, says, in part,
The generality of children who are listening are healthier, more contented, and more robust than hitherto.
The writer instances
A child of a gentleman of my acquaintance. 6 months ago, this child suffered from general debility and nervousness, and no improvement was made. Since she has taken up listening, she has become robust and healthy.
good news there, but hold on, there's more.
Is there anything in this matter which affects the health of the community in general? Or is there a new curative force at work in which atomic electricity acts on mind and body, picking up some unknown force in its transmission on the ether waves and delivering them to the recipients?
One there for Carol Vorderman. Well, let's have some more music. But first, a little explanation is required. In the 20s and 30s, all the announcers were men and attracted a great deal of fan mail. In fact, one Radio Times letters page devoted a column to love letters to announcers, many of whom were known as uncles, as the female presenters of children's programmes were known as aunties. Anyway, here is one typical letter.
Dear Uncle, am I too old to be one of your nieces? I am only 18, but everyone says I look much younger. I love your voice. Shall I be bold? Let us meet. I often stand in front of the Gaiety.
The Gaiety Theatre in the Strand, part of Marconi House, which housed the 2LO radio studio.
And I look up at the aerial, thinking of you. Meet me there Saturday next, 2:30. Do say yes. I shall be wearing grey crepe maricane and shoes that match. See you Saturday. So long, your loving niece. Must it be that?
There were apparently many letters in a similar vein, and Flotsam and Jetsam came up with this.
Little Betty Bouncer is kind to her people and a nice girl more or less.
But at present, no joke, she's causing her folks no end of deep distress.
For she is quite mad about a man she's never met.
And it's all through an innocent crystal set.
Little Miss Bouncer loves an announcer down at the BBC.
She doesn't know his name, but how she rejoices when she hears that voice of voices.
Absolutely tireless, sitting at the wireless.
Poor little Miss B.
It's the man who announces with such a lot of passion in it.
The Daventry shipping forecast will follow in a minute. Little Miss Bouncer loves an announcer down at the BBC.
She almost passes right away, the silly little clown, whenever he announces that the station's closing down.
You'd think from her behavior when he mentions oscillation that there wasn't any difference between that and osculation.
His voice must be peculiar, for the other afternoon he spoke of Mr. Jetson and she fell into a swoon.
Another night she wept aloud and tore her flaxen tresses because he hadn't mentioned her among the SOSs.
When she came to, this sentimental kid couldn't stand it any longer, and what do you think she did? Little Miss Bouncer wrote to the announcer down at the BBC.
The answer she received is worth reciting by return of post in plain handwriting.
All addressed and dated, this is what it stated.
Dear little Miss B.
Here's a picture of my babies, and the eldest is the laddie, who you may like to know is the image of his daddy.
To dear Miss Bouncer from the wife of the announcer down at the BBC.
Flotsam and Jetsam. Here's a first, 1926.
Why, oh why?
And they're still asking. The grumbling between those who prefer classical music and those who like dance music has rumbled more or less unchanged from the beginning of broadcasting. A northern listener, writing in August 1931, sums it up.
Surely, the time has come to cease this petty bickering between those who are not sufficiently of this generation to enjoy the noises for which Jack Payne and his orchestra are responsible, or sufficiently mentally equipped to appreciate the works of Mozart.
By 1935, dance bands had multiplied rather like triffids, and although it was all to end in tears in the 1940s with the plug money scandals, in the 30s the number and variety of the dance orchestras prove how popular they were. On the 28th of June 1935, R. Dudley of Southampton wrote to Radio Times,
May I ask through your columns if any reader could inform me of the signature tunes of the following bands?
He names them and Radio Times gives him the information. The list is as follows.
Harry Roy, Bugle Call Rag. Roy Fox, Whispering. Ambrose, When Day Is Done. Henry Hall, It's Just the Time for Dancing. Jack Hilton, Oh, Listen to the Band.
And grass is wet with twilight dew. My lonely heart is sinking with the sun. Although I miss your tender kiss the whole day through, I miss you most of all when day the time for dancing. Tomorrow is today. Go where the music's calling and dance the blues away. The world that lies before you, here's one big dancing floor, and all you need to ask for is just one dance floor.
the program concludes, and here is Jack Hilton to say good night.
I hope you've all enjoyed our program this evening, ladies and gentlemen. My entertainers and myself thank you all for listening. Good night.
Well, there you are, straight from the 30s to you, without passing go. But how does an editor choose the letters to be printed? With me in the studio is Russell Twisk, who cut his journalistic teeth at Radio Times, went on to be the editor of the Radio Times sister paper, The Listener, and who is now the editor-in-chief of the UK edition of Reader's Digest. How important do you think a letters page is to a magazine?
It's absolutely vital. It's the lungs of a magazine, really. If you get a lively letters page, you know you've got a good issue. If it's a dull letters page, you've got a dull magazine.
Well, how do you choose the letters then? I mean, how do you spike it up?
Well, there's lots of ways of doing it. I mean, you often get people writing to you saying, you know, I spotted a lamppost in the Aeneid line, but you have to tempt people. You sort of get people to irritate other people, and then you somehow get them into the magazine that way.
But did you ever have to make up letters? I mean, you thought, well, this is a bit thin this week, let's invent one. Let's all sit around and invent one. Come on, you can own that now.
Well, no, we never did, but there was a famous one in the Radio Times back in 1928. Val Gielgud got a job in the BBC, and he, Eric Maschwitz, gave him the job. He's the editor of Radio Times. And Maschwitz wanted desperately to be a drama producer, so he kept writing letters to the Radio Times saying how awful the output of the drama was. And after a few weeks, people said, OK, well, let him direct a play if he's that good. So he directed a play, and the first play he directed had Wreath in it. And Wreath actually took a part. It was called Tilly of Bloomsbury. And Wreath actually turned up, but he turned up late for rehearsals, and Gielgud, without looking around, said, if you're in my play, you've got to be on time. And he looked around, and Wreath, 2 or 3 weeks later, the head of drama job came up. He said, well, that man who was rude to me, let's give it to him. So that's how it's...
wonderful. That's a great story. Let's try that. Russell, you have wide experience in this field. What sort of person is it who picks up a pen and writes to you?
Well, there's all the Tunbridge Wells people, Rittard, as it puts, you know, SRN Rittard. We always looked out for these people.
These retired colonels you're
exactly,
talking about.
Yes. And all in coloured pens or with coloured notepaper. These were the ones that you put perhaps at the bottom of the pile.
Oh, I see. We won't use that one in green ink on purple paper today. Is that the attitude? To show that Radio Times catered for all tastes, here is a letter from the composer Frederick Delius, writing from Grèze-sur-Loing.
In my home here in France, I greatly enjoyed listening to the concert of my works on the 30th of January. Some of the pieces I had not heard for quite a long time, and I was very much pleased with Geoffrey Toy's sensitive conducting. The playing of Salmons came out quite beautifully. I also want to thank the BBC for the kind words that were spoken to me at the beginning of the concert, and which gave such an intimate touch to the performance.
And here, with a moment of Delius, not Albert Salmons, but Tamsin Little. The Delius Violin Concerto. In 1931, there was a general election, which was won by a coalition of all parties, and a so-called national government was nominally in power, with Ramsay MacDonald as Prime Minister. Radio Times printed this.
May I express the appreciation of myself and friends to Mr. Gilly Potter in his exceedingly witty and well-thought-out speech when he addressed his electors at Little Twittering on the eve of the poll. It was a real treat of humorous wit and very much enjoyed by his numerous admirers.
And for those who don't remember Gilly Potter, this is what he sounded like.
Good evening, England. This is Gilly Potter speaking to you in English. I am speaking to you from Hoggs Norton by courtesy of the Hoggs Norton Broadcasting Company. I am here in number 1 studio. That is the one under the stairs with a chair. And here with me, having brought me down on the step of his bicycle, is my old friend Malcolm Muggeridge, at whose request I am going to sing his favourite lullaby. Clap hands, Daddy's come home, Daddy has brought us his wages home, but all I brought in was a bottle of gin and a black eye that somebody gave me. Shakespeare was young when he wrote that.
Gilly Potter. Sport now, 1935.
I would like to know why, in your running commentaries on sports, you give hours to tennis and football and can hardly spare 5 minutes to a cricket test match. I know I'm not the only one who strongly resents this treatment. There are as many interested in cricket as there are in tennis or football. W.R. Banks, Leeds.
More disappointment in 1938 from a Mr. J.H. Brock of Oxford.
I must confess myself a little disappointed with the sports bulletin of a recent Saturday. I missed the 7 o'clock news, but I listened at 6 o'clock and again at 10. Although I heard of rugby and association football, of Empire Games at Sydney, of ice hockey, of speedway, racing and cricket in India, there was no mention of the Oxford and Cambridge hockey match played at Beckenham that afternoon.
Clearly the event of the day. By now, television was up and running, but war was looming, and that meant that the embryo TV unit would be closed down for the duration, and radio departments would be scattered all over the country. But in January 1939, war seemed far off, and listeners were more concerned with parochial matters. F.J. Webber of Swindon wrote,
Very many thanks for the delightful Sark item. It seemed to us sitting here that we were having a summer holiday, and the impression was intensified by the beautifully suggestive music. Special marks to the composer.
But, of course, whatever the subject, there is always another view. Here's Mrs. D.M. Edwards, writing from Weston-super-Mare.
We have just been listening to the interesting broadcast on the island of Sark, the effect of which was quite spoilt by the superfluous and noisy incidental music.
It's now March 1939, and the subject is announcers again. Plus ça change. Here's Miss C.A. Servener, writing from Newbury, Berkshire.
It is one of my greatest joys to listen to the natural, pleasant tones of the manly voice speaking English at its best form, to which I am accustomed from the BBC. When I hear the announcer's pleasant good night, I invariably reply audibly, Good night, dear man.
And here's D. Kins of Bournemouth.
I quite definitely think all the announcers are perfect.
And H.B. Stebbing weighs in with...
The great hope for the King's English is that the BBC is gradually educating us to prefer an educated voice.
There were many dissenting opinions, but when Radio Times held a ballot asking listeners whether they supported Professor Lloyd James, who defended BBC English, or Lancashire writer and broadcaster T. Thompson, who wanted regional chaps for regional jobs and less of the la-di-da, the voting was Lloyd James 27,108, T. Thompson 2,660. The Radio Times verdict, carry on announcers. And with me now in the studio is Peter Donaldson, one of the more senior announcers of the present day. Well, while we're researching this programme, we found lots and lots of letters, people complaining about pronunciation. Do you find problems with that?
They're still coming in and have been for as long as I've been an announcer, from the earliest, possibly, controversy versus controversy. It's old people like me who say controversy, and the young people who now say controversy, and that's winning, to kilometre and kilometre. And I know the rules about that, but I still say kilometre, even though I know I should say kilometre.
Do you find problems with names? I mean, names of politicians, for instance.
Oh, well,
foreign leaders.
Wasn't that the earliest one, of course, was Sir Alhaji Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, who was first Federal Prime Minister of Nigeria, but no sooner had the announcer got his tongue around that word than he was shot dead. And there's been some Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. But my favourite was a far simpler one than that. On the religious programme, the Sunday programme on Radio 4, I came across this name, Canaan Banana. And I was told, no, you can't possibly say banana. So I had to say Canaan Banana. And now, as we all know, it is Canaan Banana.
Of all the many letters you have received, I know you've received a lot of mail over the years.
A lot usually to do with pronunciation, but this one has nothing to do with pronunciation, and it is my all-time favourite because of its simplicity. Dear Sir or Madam, your news bulletin at 6 p.m. on Radio 4 is usually immediately preceded by the sound of a clock striking 6. But yesterday, the 9th of March, there was no sound of a clock, only 6 pips. I'm not complaining, I'm not asking why, but I want you to know that somebody did actually notice it.
Peter Donaldson, thank you very much for being my
Thank goodness
guest
for the listener.
Some more music now. In 1939, Dick Bentley arrived from Australia, and he was already an experienced broadcaster. After the war, in Take It From Here, he gave us Ron from the Glums and many other roles. In 1939, he was a presenter of gramophone records, and a listener wrote,
Thousands of people may ask for their favourite records each week, but do please tell me who asked for Dick Bentley.
That said, what were the favourite records of 1939? Here's a selection.
You're sophisticated.
I think I'm naive.
Well, let's play the game that way.
Yes, that's what I believe. An apple for the teacher, that seems the thing to do. Because I want to learn about romance from you. An apple for the teacher, just to show that I'm meek and mild. If you insist on saying that I'm just a problem child, you're going to get all my attention, and your wish will be my rule. And maybe you'll be good to me, just keep me after school. An apple for the teacher, that's how I better start. Then after a while you may give in and let me bring my heart.
Oh, jeepers, creepers, where'd you get those beavers? Jeepers, creepers, where'd you get those eyes? Oh gosh, I'll get how'd you get so lit gosh, I'll get how'd you get that size? Oh golly gee, when you turn the heaters on, woe is me. Got to put my cheaters on. Jeepers, creepers, where'd you get those beavers? Oh, those weepers, how'd the hypnotize, yes. Where'd you get those eyes, gape? Where'd you get those eyes, satch? Where'd you get those eyes? Ba-ba-da-dee-da-do-do-do-do-do. Those eyes.
Roll out the barrel. We'll have a barrel of fun. Roll out the barrel. We've got the blues on the run. Sing, boom, tarero. Ring out a song of good cheer. Now's the time to roll the barrel, for the gang's all here. Roll it out, roll it out, roll out the barrel. Sing a song of good cheer, 'cause the whole gang is here. Roll it out, let's do the beer barrel polka.
When war came in September 1939, the BBC was prepared. In fact, plans had been made in 1938 for the dispersal of the various departments. It was assumed at the time that the war would begin with massive air raids, but that fear didn't become justified until 1940. At the beginning, it was just poor old Poland getting it in the neck, which prompted L.J. Dowdry of Ilford to write,
I suggest that we might have the Polish national anthem frequently over the air, as I am sure that the great majority of listeners, myself included, have no idea of the tune or the words.
Well-meaning, no doubt, but faintly ridiculous. Other letters in Radio Times during September 1939 tell of mixed emotions. For instance, this from Anthony Panting of London West 1.
It is interesting to see that it takes a European war to establish the place of dance music, as opposed to sustaining music on Sundays.
MHS of Llandudno wrote,
May I express great appreciation of the early morning programmes. It's a real treat to have some worthwhile music, symphonies, etc., which up to last week were only possible from foreign stations. May they continue.
Two satisfied customers there, albeit from opposite sides of the classics versus popular music divide. Here now is a gentleman taking the BBC to task for...
apparently dying of surprise at its own cleverness in putting anything on the air at all. J.P. Cooper, Birmingham.
Most listeners wanted soothing, as this letter from Mrs. M. Lynch of Brighton shows.
I must express my thanks for Sir Walford Davis' lovely little talk, The Tranquil Mind. It was indeed calm and soothing in these unhappy times.
F.O. and M. Powell of Clapham Southwest 4 doubtless agreed. They wrote,
Sandy McPherson's quiet voice is very reassuring at a time when our ears are on the alert for warning sirens.
And on the subject of air raids, Helen Harris-Jackson of Cheam was worried.
I would like to make a request that, should a raid warning be given during broadcasting hours, the programme should be interrupted for the announcement of such. I am certain that as winter approaches, with windows muffled as they now must be, we should not hear the sirens above the radio.
Oh, yes, you could. Too young to remember? Oh, this is what the air raid warning sounded like. But to another sort of noise, as described by music lover of Braunton, Devon.
Why so much organ music? An organ is essentially a church instrument, and to hear raucous music played on it is an offence to the ear. Keep to solemn music, Mr. McPherson, please.
But not too solemn, please, wrote William Hendy of Barnes.
Sunday, the 17th of September. Church of Scotland service, an inspiring sermon, helpful prayers, and dreary, dreary singing, O God of Bethel, by whose hand, a grand hymn, with all the brakes on hard and with grossly overemphasised pianissimo effects. I got the feeling that we had hopelessly lost the war already.
Down in the dumps, Mr. Hendy. Here's a remedy.
Why not try half an hour on Sunday mornings of good old hymn tunes played heartily by a Salvation Army band? Say about 11 o'clock in the morning while Mother is getting the dinner. Our Hill, Stoke-on-Trent.
Brushing briskly past the lack of political correctness embodied in the last sentence, at least Our Hill is cheerful, which is more than can be said for H.J. Gorlick of Clapham.
I cannot believe that the miserable skeleton paraded before us as the BBC Home Service represents the best effort of which the corporation is capable. Is it possible that in the future the poor creature may assume a more robust appearance?
Well, someone writing from the Isle of Wight is pretty gloomy too.
Both day and night, the Home Service transmission is uniformly bad.
Thank you and good night. Mind you, there was always Arthur Askey, Richard Stinker Murdoch and Bandwagon. A Mrs. Varney wrote from Portsmouth.
3 cheers for Bandwagon. If only Hitler had had a stinker to say to him, "Oh, you silly little man," every time he looked like putting his foot in things, their country wouldn't be in the state it is today.
As Hitler had just shattered Poland, and in due course would do the same to Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Norway and France, putting his foot in it is not a phrase that comes immediately to mind. I smell a hint of Ministry of Information propaganda there, but nonetheless, Arthur Askey and company were very, very funny.
Well, here we are, everybody, with another bandwagon.
Oh, I wish we could find a new way of starting this show besides you saying that.
No, stop it, Big. We had all that out last week.
Yes, but you must admit it gets a bit humdrum.
Aye, proper humdrum.
Aye, it's really humdrum. We had that out last week, too, didn't we?
Well, let's tell them the joke about old Nasty's father and mother.
No, the censor had that out this morning, if I remember right, Leah.
Oh, yes. In any case, Big, remember what we agreed? We were going to give old Nasty a rest this week and talk about something else for a change.
Yes, but you feel you'd like to say something about him. You know, he's pinched a lot of our publicity, hasn't he? I mean, he's had his name in the paper every day this week.
Anyway, Mrs. Bagwash isn't worried about him.
Oh, she doesn't care a hoot. She said to me this morning, it's no good them Germans sitting up in those balloons over London trying to frighten us because they can't.
Here's more about humour.
May Amir Parsons' wife say how much she and her husband enjoy the Happydrome? After a strenuous Sunday, to relax and listen to Mr. Corris's delightful patter makes a pleasant hour before the news. Mrs. C. Britton, Goodhurst, Kent.
They were obviously starved of entertainment in Goodhurst, but for old time's sake, and to capture a moment of typical wartime light entertainment, here is a reminder of Happydrome with Mr. Lovejoy, Enoch and Ramsbottom.
And now we come to the piece de resistance of the evening. In other words, our trio. Are you ready, my angel choir?
Yes, Governor. And Enoch tells me that he's going away to study singing.
Good. How far?
About 10 miles. You can walk it easy in 2 hours if you can run.
Well, if you want to study singing, you want to go to Naples.
Come again?
Naples. Have you never heard of Naples?
Oh, aye. An apple a day keeps the doctor away.
Oh, what's the use? Let's go.
Nothing ever worries us, nothing makes us blue. When trouble knocks upon our door, this is what we do. On the ukulele, we keep strumming gaily, tra-la-la-la-la.
We three from Happydrome there. There's no doubt that the comedy hit of the war was Itmar. It starred Tommy Hanley, who'd been a regular broadcast since 1924, plus a large cast of excellent actors. The scripts were written by Ted Kavanagh and produced by Francis Worsley. It was a hit formula from the word go and grew into one of the most popular comedies ever broadcast. Everyone listened, with the possible exception of Professor C.E.M. Joad, who was himself a national figure thanks to his many appearances on the Brains Trust, a forum for intellectual debate. When asked if he enjoyed Itmar, Joad replied, "Alas, superior person, haughty highbrow, despised of the common joys of humanity that I am, I have never heard Itmar." Adding insult to injury, he also sent Tommy Hanley a telegram which read, "Congratulations, for the 200th time I have not heard you." Hanley replied, "Thanks for all your good wishes. I'm always delighted to hear from a brother comic." Joad wasn't alone. Listeners wrote to Radio Times,
"The puns served up in last night's Itmar were an insult to anyone's intelligence."
And another listener wrote from Welwyn Garden City,
"I implore you please to have Itmar and Fumph painlessly removed from future programmes."
But such critics were in the minority. In 1944, the celebrated pianist Moira Limpany wrote from Oxshott,
"I know tastes differ, and that is why perhaps some people do not care for Itmar, but surely its lovable characters and the absurdity of their jokes are just what we need now of all times. Personally, it is always a matter of regret to me if a professional engagement prevents me from listening in and enjoying every moment of it."
And what were they all writing about? Listen to a few moments of Tommy Hanley and Itmar.
Now, on the Zambezi, I felt a bit queasy. I swallowed a cobra, and that wasn't easy. Prokop is out tomorrow. I was stung on my sojourn by a hotsy-totsy fly. A sort of gnat that knits nets in knots and knots in nets. Well, here you see this flap-footed flugy with the fly.
That's not a fly, that's an elephant.
Well, the fly's on the elephant's ramparts. Now, to conduct this elephant through the pampas, I engaged a Scottish jumbo waller. Mahout was his name. He gave me some very good advice, and his parting words to me were, "Sire, never let your braces dangle in the jungle." Now, my faithful elephant unfortunately contracted distemper on the Irrawaddy, and with great regret, I had to shoot him through the yaws.
What's yours?
I'll have a bottle of stout. Now, this...
Tommy Hanley died in January 1949, and the country mourned. Among the many letters received by Radio Times was this from Eric Rosenthal of Stoke Newington, North London.
The first Itmar that I ever heard was 10 years ago in a North London secondary school on the evening of Breaking Up Day. I had come here as a refugee child from Vienna, and the lack of a school uniform barred me from attending the day's festivities. My disappointment and humiliation were considerably relieved by the cheerful sound of Itmar, which I discovered by chance on the common room wireless. Although I had little English then, I caught the infectious gaiety and bright universal nonsense of that man's quick patter, and knew at last whence the other schoolboys derived the peculiar sayings that made up most of their, to me, quite puzzling conversations. From that day to this, I have never missed a show. A great man becomes the property of his admirers. Tommy Hanley will be mourned for long and remembered forever.
By 1951, television was now firmly established, but radio was still the major force in broadcasting, and had from its beginnings broadcast a great deal of sport. But, as we have seen, however comprehensive the sports coverage is, there's always someone who is dissatisfied. Let us leap forward to 1972, and this letter from Robert Stone of Cambridge.
Who had the bright idea of limiting Sport on 2 to 1,500 metres and expanding Radio 1's programmes into the VHF slot for 5.5 hours? It'll make no difference to those who only get medium and long waves. But for those whose radios are VHF only, sport is irretrievably replaced by popular music. I can think of no one who could conceivably benefit from the change.
Well, I don't quite get the drift of that, but I'm sure that Mr. Stone has a point. The VHF revolution left many people with sets that only gave them limited access to the BBC's range of programmes. Miss A.N. Hepworth of Sutton in Ashfield was most indignant.
What happened to the boat race this year?
Cambridge won. Oxford won. I'm sorry, I'm just being facetious.
Why such meagre radio coverage? First of all, it was hard enough to find the item in Radio Times. Then VHF could only produce Radio 1. When we did track it down on long wave, all we got was an aggravating football commentary and a half sentence here and there telling us the race was actually taking place. Please don't tell me BBC One had a 45-minute programme on it. We don't happen to have a TV set.
And aggravating football commentary? They had those back in 1929.
After listening to the running commentary on the Arsenal versus Derby County match the other Saturday, I was surprised to hear such a capable man as Mr. Allison persistently giving his personal views on how the game should be played, instead of keeping us informed as to how the game was being played. I hope in future commentators will give us a true description of the play and not a personal opinion.
Well, you could hardly blame George Allison for bias. After all, he was the Arsenal manager. 1951 produced this glowing tribute from Lord Alness, no less, writing from Bournemouth about Wimbledon.
May I be allowed to express my unqualified admiration of Max Robertson's commentaries. He has a wonderful technique in describing the happenings on the courts, and his asides, anent the weather, the spectators, the appearance and history of the players, were wholly delightful.
And here is the incomparable Max in action.
Advantage, Almeida.
Third match point. Sun coming out. Brightly, possibly for Lever's extinction. As Lever serves now, and he goes in as he does. Serves to the left-hand court, a fault. Second one is right to the backhand. He goes up, a backhand down the line. Lever, a backhand volley. Almeida, backhand. He beats Lever into his body. Comes up to the net, puts his arm round Lever. And they both thank the umpire guy.
Max Robertson there in 1959. Oh, I say. However, there is, as so often in any debate on broadcasting, another side to the coin. Step forward, ABB of Shanklin, Isle of Wight.
For one person who is thrown into ecstasies by the mere mention of tennis, 100 are frankly bored by the reiterated account of how X served and Y failed to get across.
One way or another these days, it seems that no ball is hit, no racket swung, no boot trips an opponent, no British athlete unluckily loses, without 1,000 radio and television stations telling us the story in minute detail. But who would miss a moment like this?
Lawrence, always entertaining, batting for 35 minutes, hit a 4 over the wicketkeepers. Angus, for goodness sake, stop it. Hit a
There's Lawrence. Lawrence played extremely well.
Hit a 4 over the wicketkeeper's head, and he was out for 9. And Tufnell came batted for 12 minutes, and then was caught by Haynes on Patterson for 2, and there were 54 extras, and England were all out for 419. I've stopped laughing now.
Aggers and Johners, of course. Over the years, there has been much controversy over studio audiences. These letters to Radio Times are typical of the many that have been written by those for and against. Here's W.F. Lidbury of Sutton.
Audiences at radio shows? By all means, but suppress clapping except at the entry and exit of artists.
B.A. Clark of London North 6 has an interesting suggestion.
Since comedians cannot be funny without audible appreciation, it would seem that studio audiences are an inevitable evil. In these days, when technicians can perform such wonders, would it not be possible to let the comedians have the applause while cutting it off from the home listener?
The answer is that no, it would not be possible. Mind you, other listeners would like the studio audience banned altogether.
If a comedian cannot work without an audience, then I think he should be regarded as unsuitable for broadcasting.
So says H.A. Armstrong of Stocksfield, Northumberland. N.J. Mountfort of Alton, Birmingham is not quite so severe.
We listeners do not object to audiences as such, but to their behaviour. They spoil many a good programme by the noise they make.
Kit Oswell of Market Drayton has his own rather personal reaction to members of the audience who whistle their appreciation.
If I am lucky enough to get a ticket for a broadcast variety show, I shall carry concealed on my person a meat axe. With this, I shall accurately and firmly strike that public menace, the man who whistles through his teeth.
I don't think I can improve on that idea. But let's hie ourselves to a more solemn subject, the Archers. And in particular, Grace Archer's death.
Now, come on.
All out now.
Yes, take these two. Okay, I've got Judy.
I've got the other.
It's an inferno in there. Placement will be as dry as a tinder. Come on, get well away. Oh, my gosh, we're lucky to get him out. Yes, certainly were. What's up?
Midnight couldn't have been tied. Look, she's going back into the stable.
What? No, Grace. No, don't do it.
She's going in after Midnight.
Grace! Grace! Grace, come back! The roof's collapsing! For God's sake, Grace, come back! you fool! Let me go! Grace is in there! Let me go, blast it!
The Archers is undoubtedly a splendid programme. For me, it is an even more splendid programme in view of the new turn of events, for we are shown that the story is capable of embracing genuine tragedy.
Kenneth Dudley of Oxford adds,
if the listeners expect real life and not just an excuse to escape from it, they should be tough enough to accept Grace's death without undue fuss.
But the very Reverend Roscoe Shedden, writing from Woodstock, Oxfordshire, admits that he was very upset. So much so that...
The death of Grace simply knocked me flat, and I burst out crying aloud.
For goodness sake, man, pull yourself together. It's only fiction. But ever since its birth, The Archers has had high praise and deep criticism, as befits something as bold, adventurous and sustaining as that brilliant piece of radio. Here's F.E. Barber, writing in 1953,
when will The Archers series finish? What will be the end of it all?
Finish? The Archers? Never. I feel that, like the weather, it will be with us forever. Which brings us to Mrs. C. Don of Prestwich, Manchester, who wrote in January 1954...
How delighted many housewives would have been on Monday the 18th of January to hear the announcer inform them that it would be a good drying day. To them, this snippet of information was worth more than a dozen weather forecasts.
Well, one housewife wasn't delighted.
The announcer who told us that it would be a good drying day proved to be a bad prophet. Please do not raise our hopes in this way again.
Of course, that lady lived in London, a far cry from breezy Manchester. Pop music and disc jockeys were becoming, and still are, of major concern to radio listeners. By 1977, some listeners were becoming fed up with
dull DJs repeating themselves and talking endless gibberish between records, narcissistic self-advertisements and desperate fun-quenching jingles exasperating in-jokes, and a general tendency to treat the listener as an identikit housewife from St Albans.
Thus, A.J. Mattick of Tetbury, Gloucestershire. Of course, none of this applies to Terry Wogan. Or does it? Here's Mrs. Jean Mills of Ivor Heath in 1980, who called his seemingly endless prattle about J.R. and cones
irritating and boring in the extreme.
To which Terry replied in Radio Times, the woman is right, of course. If I'd been listening to me recently, I'd have been beside myself with boredom too. Which was honest of him, if nothing else. But fear not, Terry, they love you really. As Mrs. Muriel D. Clark of Tunbridge in Kent confesses.
I freely admit to being a fan of Terry Wogan, as I much value his ability to amuse his listeners with cheerful nonsense, no matter how grave the news.
And here is the cheery Wogan and the floral dance.
I thought I could hear the curious tone of the cornet, clarinet and big trombone, fiddle, cello, big bass drum, bassoon, flute and euphonium, each one making the most of his chance, all together in the floral dance.
Terry has much to be cheerful about, as has that other superlative broadcaster, David Jacobs. Mr. J.R. Adams of Swanley, Kent, writing in 1985, was most enthusiastic.
Whoever it was who had the brilliant idea of putting David Jacobs on Radio 2 on weekdays should be well and truly congratulated.
Congratulations, too, to Ken Bruce from Georgina Meredith Jones of Ashley, Wiltshire.
Welcome to Ken Bruce. In 1 week, he has replaced 12 years of fatuous mumbling with a brisk programme of tuneful music interspersed with short, pithy comments.
But what are the letters pages in Radio Times today? With me in the studio is the current editor of Radio Times, Sue Robinson. And you do look like your picture in Radio Times, which is great.
Kind.
Now, I must ask, how many letters do you get in a week?
At our busiest times, we get between 500 and 600. That's a lot, but it includes email, which is becoming increasingly popular, faxes and phone calls too.
Oh, really? Because in the early days, it was just they whipped out their quill pen and applied it to the parchment.
Didn't stop them, though, did it?
No, it didn't. But I see you give prizes for letters, prize letters. Why do you do that?
We don't actually need it. We don't need to do it to attract more letters. We thought it was just a nice extra to have on the page to point out, to encourage people to think about the sort of letters they're writing, really. And we award the prize to a letter that's particularly original or is witty, has a really good point to make.
How do you choose the letters? I mean, is it random? Do you open a dozen and say, oh, these will do, or do you go through all the 600?
Oh, no, we open and read every single letter.
Right.
And choosing a lead for the page is pretty easy because we want that to reflect what people have written in most about that week. But the rest of it is picking a really good mix, a nice balance, so there's some serious, thoughtful letters, bit of fun, some witty ones. Sometimes we encourage a debate to continue, so we look for letters that are going to carry that on through the pages. So a real mix.
Well, and it is a terrific read. Thank you very much, Sue. We've nearly finished our rummage through the editor's postbag, and it's time not to sum up, but to congratulate the various editors and the thousands of letter writers whose words have appeared in print in the august organ since 1923. Listeners have been not only purveyors of opinion, but of information too. Want to know how tall George Frederick Handel was? J.M. Lees of Manchester is your man.
Handel's height was 6 feet 1 inch.
Thank you. Want to know whether the new century starts in the year 2000 or 2001? Hugh Nicol of Glasgow reminds us of the year when a new century came into being. He wrote in 1949...
The statement by Michael Standing suggests he may be sharing the idea that 1899 was the last year of the 19th century. In a news talk from Glasgow given before the British railways were nationalised, I mentioned that railway nationalisation was proposed by a Scot in the 18th century, more precisely in November 1800.
Right. Got that? Now, which RAF fighter won the Battle of Britain in 1940? W.N. Harrison of Sheffield has the answer.
While not wishing to belittle the honours due to the Spitfire, may I point out that the Hawker Hurricane is credited with the largest number of victories for any one type of British aircraft during the battle.
Mainly because there were more of them, as was pointed out recently. Back in 1924, JRC of Sheffield was being helpful to other listeners on a ticklish subject.
Dear sir, I have a crystal set which gives very loud signals. Invariably, 2 sets of headphones are in use, the earpieces of which are connected together by metal bands. And thereby hangs a tail.
Gripping, isn't it?
When my father dons the phones, he says that the crystal is old, or that the whisker is weary, or that the engineer at the station has forgotten to wind up the spring. But when he takes them off and another puts them on, he or she can almost hear the swish of the conductor's baton.
Stand by. I think we're approaching the punchline.
After much hard thinking, I have solved the mystery. My father is rather inclined to baldness, and the metal bands touching his bare head short-circuit the earpieces, thus very considerably diminishing the volume of sound.
Or perhaps the old boy was rather inclined to deafness. However,
if there are any other listeners who are bald, let them fold a handkerchief between their head and the metal bands.
And we are worried about going digital. Well, we've tried to cram 74 years into 57 minutes and failed miserably. However, it's been fun for me and my producer, Elizabeth Funning. Thanks also to our readers, Nicolette Mackenzie, Christopher Wright and Alistair Danson. It's just time to remind you about Auntie's Family Album, 4 programmes of nostalgia from Radio 2 archives, presented by Michael Aspel. Sounds good to me. One last letter to the editor, Radio Times, published in October 1997, from Ian Laws of Brighton.
Thank goodness for the Round Britain quiz. At last, an intelligent game show is beginning to take pop music seriously. All it needs now are some contestants who can answer the questions.
On behalf of everyone who's written to Radio Times, goodbye.
Olden days had different ways, their pleasures then were fewer. Modern days will get my praise, our wireless ways are newer. A stirring time, a whirring time, a record time for father time. The daily times that Big Ben chimes are Radio Times.